You're listening to Scholars and Saints, the University of Virginia Mormon Studies podcast. I'm Stephen Betts. Scholars and Saints is brought to you by support from the Mormon Studies program in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. Music for this episode is provided by Ben Howington. To hear more, visit mormonguitar.com. The body has always played a central role in Latter-day Saint religious experience. Touching, seeing, building, walking, sweating, even bleeding sculpt the ways Latter-day Saints think about God, the world, and themselves. From the gold plates to the Mormon Trail to the Salt Lake Temple, Latter-day Saints mark and interpret space in ways that have profound implications for history and memory. Today I speak with Professor Sara Patterson about her recent book, Pioneers in the Attic, Place and Memory Along the Mormon Trail, published by Oxford University Press. For questions or comments about this or any episode, email me at scholarsandsaintspodcast@gmail.com or find me on Twitter by the handle @ScholarsSaints. Sara Patterson joins us today from Hanover College to discuss her book, Pioneers in the Attic, Place and Memory Along the Mormon Trail, recently out from Oxford University Press. Thanks for joining us today, Sara.
Thanks for having me.
So Sara, tell us a little bit about what brings you to the study of Mormonism. It's obviously a rather niche field, and you do it very well. So tell us about that.
Oh, thank you. I think that it's kind of lost in the midst of time how I initially got interested in Mormon studies. But in graduate school, I focused on American religious history, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was always just a fascinating movement to me. And I think that it's one of the groups that I had a lot of questions about and enjoyed trying to find answers, and I still continue to have questions. So it's kept me interested for a long time.
So you studied under Ann Taves, right, in your graduate work?
I did.
So there's also that connection with her work on, religious experience. Has any of her work played into how you has that been important for you?
Yeah, I think it was after I was done studying with her that she got more interested in Mormon religious experiences. But I think that as a teacher, she's influenced just so much of my thought, especially with bringing a lens to the study of religious experiences and thinking about how individual believers understand their traditions.
Yeah, and obviously this plays, a really big role in this book, which is about memory work and the ways that Latter-day Saints and others in the Latter-day Saint tradition conceive of history and its importance and how it can be used to understand present identity or construct present identities. So those will be things that we should definitely talk about. If you wouldn't mind, give us a kind of thumbnail sketch of the important stories that you tell in your book. You focus on a couple of different stories, and they're all focused on place. So could you give us a little sketch of those stories?
Yes, I start the book by talking about Independence, Missouri, which is a site that Joseph Smith declared was Zion. And so in my introduction, I look at the contested claims in Independence between three churches that claim Joseph Smith as a prophet. And then I turn to Nauvoo, Illinois as another site where there are contested claims to space. And I look at the relationship between the reorganized Latter-day Saints, who are now the Community of Christ, who own portions of Nauvoo, and then the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who also owns portions of Nauvoo. In addition, I talk about Martin's Cove in Wyoming as a site of communal suffering. So I think about how a theology of suffering is written onto the landscape there. And then one of the main focuses of the text is this is the place, Heritage Park, which is in Salt Lake City, and is a site that commemorates where Brigham Young stood when he looked out over the Salt Lake Valley and declared that it was the place where believers would live and create Zion.
Yeah, and then you kind of end with this discussion of monuments that commemorate the Mountain Meadows Massacre and how that plays into, this kind of contested memory. Really fascinating. So you have a couple of main themes that seem to run throughout, and I'm wondering if we could just make help our listeners kind of get in the mindset of some of the things we'll talk about today by going over some of these themes a little bit here at the beginning. So one of the really interesting ones that you pull from Eric Eliason's work and really develop is this idea of the spiritualization of the pioneer, or what Eric Eliason calls pioneerification. So talk a little bit about about the spiritualization and how that plays into this story of contested memory.
Well, the story of the pioneers was such a central story to the Mormons who moved westward. And for obvious reasons, it was their exodus. They had read it in terms of the scriptures that they read, and it was core to their identity. And for some time, it was celebrated in terms of biology. So people in Utah would talk about how they were connected to that story through their ancestors. And I think of the 1947 centennial celebration of their entry into the Salt Lake Valley. They reenacted the Mormon Trek. And when they did that, they only had people who were direct descendants of the pioneers participate. And that, I think, is an example of how important that claim to ancestry is. In the late 20th century, as more and more believers were not descended from the pioneers of 1847, the story became spiritualized in an effort to keep it meaningful to believers. And so what that looked like was the claim that believers were the inheritors of the story, and that they were spiritual, and the pioneers were spiritual ancestors of everybody. So they could be looked to as models of how to live a faithful life, of the kinds of sacrifices that one might have to make for their faith. And so spiritualizing was a way to keep that central narrative meaningful as the makeup of the church was changing. One of the things that I talk about in the book is how there hasn't been a reckoning with aspects of the pioneer story that can be problematic. So, for example, it is in part a story of whiteness. And so community members of color might not find it a particularly meaningful story. And in addition to being a story of whiteness, it's also a story of empire. And so I think those aspects of the story haven't been talked about or thought about enough in the church. As the story is changing to try to be more inclusive of people, there are still these aspects of the story that haven't been addressed.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's some fascinating work being done right now by people like, Elise Boxer, who works on Mormon settler colonialism, and others. But yeah, you're right. That this is an aspect of the story that's problematic in terms of harmonizing memory and making memory work for a globalized church. Yeah, that's a very good point. One of the ways that identity is constructed in the book, specifically for the Utah church, is this what you call the Smithification. Again, one of these great words, Smithification of the West and of the landscape. So talk a little bit about that and what you mean by the Smithification.
So the book is talking about collective memory, and one of the narratives that I discuss is the history telling that developed around the idea that Joseph Smith, as a prophet, foresaw what would transpire after his death. And that includes that he knew that Brigham Young was his successor, knew that Young was going to take believers westward, that Utah would become Zion. And so I look at how that narrative, what I'm calling the Smithification of the West, gets written onto the landscape. So the kinds of memory work that are happening along the Mormon Trail. And I think that narrative has been around for a long time, but that it became particularly important to memorialize it when two anniversaries coincided with one another. And that was the 1997 sesquicentennial anniversary of the entry into the Salt Lake Valley, and the 2005 bicentennial celebration of Joseph Smith's death. I think it was an important time in collective memory to show that those two stories were part of the same story. You could think about the death of a prophet as this I think I use the phrase rupture in history, but the collective memory places those stories together so that the transition from Smith to Young and from Illinois to Utah become just part of a larger divine vision that prophets can access. And one of the monuments that I think best shows that is a monument called Eyes Westward, which is in actually two sites. It's in Nauvoo, Illinois, and the sculpture shows Joseph Smith and Brigham Young kind of leaning together and looking out, clearly sharing some vision of what they're both looking at. And in Brigham Young's hand is a scroll, and on it, it says Map of the West. And so part of that smithifying that I'm talking about is the idea that Joseph Smith not just kind of knew the West conceptually, but that he actually drew maps of the West that Brigham Young could follow, that he had watched the journey westward, that he knew what the Salt Lake Valley was going to look like. In one account, he even talks about him drinking a glass of water and saying that it tastes like the water of the Rocky Mountains. So it's more than just a kind of vague knowing, it's a very literal, physical, embodied kind of knowing of what's going to happen in the future. So there's one version of it in Nauvoo, and the two are positioned so they're looking out across the Mississippi River. And that is placed right on the boundary line between the part of Nauvoo that's owned by the LDS Church and the part of Nauvoo that's owned by the Community of Christ. And I think that that is significant, that it's a claim that our guy was the guy who Joseph Smith saw as his successor. And then the second version is placed in, this is the place, State Park. And there it's positioned so that the two are looking out over the Salt Lake Valley. And this is the place, State Park is not a particularly contested site. It is in Mormon territory. But I think the message there is that visitors can come and look out over the valley and they can see the vision that Smith and Brigham Young had. So they can participate in that kind of embodied imagination of the future.
Yeah, embodiment obviously plays a huge role in what you call felt religion. Yeah, this idea that creating or cultivating these kinds of memory requires a physical component that translates the desired vision of the past onto the body in important ways. And I love this quote you have on early in the book where you talk about, and this is theoretical language for our listeners, but you talk about these creative slippages within Mormonism that take place between the literal and the metaphorical, text and object, and history and space. So there are like these two really important dynamics between that you talk about throughout the book, between maybe turning the conceptual into material and turning the material into the conceptual. Like, I think these are two really important things that we have to keep in mind. And these obviously are the dynamics by which Smithification takes place, specifically from the idealizing the material, or excuse me, making the conceptual into material, and then you have Pioneerification, which is the opposite, right? And so that's that tension at the center. I'd like to talk a little bit about your methods. And a lot of Mormon studies is a broad field, and it's very interdisciplinary, and some, just as in other parts of the academy, some of it tends to be more historical, and some tends towards more religious studies oriented methods. And obviously yours is the latter. And I think that the kinds of theories that you use as you study Mormonism really opens up a lot of possibilities for thinking about religion in general. And so that's why I like to focus for a few minutes on that, and maybe draw out how you're using those methods on using different examples from the book. So you talk about space, and you use what people in the academy call cultural geography. So maybe tell us a little bit, what does that term mean, cultural geography? And then let's talk about how spaces become sacred, because this is obviously so central to your argument.
So talking about sacred spaces, I think one of the arguments that folks in this field make is that places are not, we tend to think of places and objects as objective facts. And we don't think about the fact that people are always engaging spaces and interpreting what those spaces mean and acting in accordance with how they understand what the spaces mean. And so in terms of sacred spaces, there are a couple of theorists who were important to my work. Chittister and Linenthal are two of them. And they talk about how communities are always interpreting spaces, that they are always storying spaces. So they're always telling narratives about what the space means to the particular community, and that the communities are also always ritualizing those spaces. So they're marking them through their activities as set apart and different from other spaces. And then their last argument is that sacred spaces are contested spaces. And so that often comes through in narratives when there are moments where someone tries to take over the space or say that the space means something different, and that becomes part of the communal narrative, and in the end ends up proving to the group that the space itself is sacred. So those ideas are throughout my book. And then I think I would add that Belden Lane brings up an important point to remember when thinking about sacred spaces. And his point is really that we shouldn't think of landscapes as blank slates. It's not like we're all moving through a flat world with nothing on it and just reading meaning onto it, but that the landscape itself participates in the creation of the space. And so I think that's an important idea to think about, that communities are kind of in dialogue with landscapes in creating the sacred spaces.
Yeah, I really like how you put that in dialogue with the landscape, because for the longest time in the study of religion, people who studied religions thought, well, religion is this thing that happens in your head, and it's this thing that happens in the creation of sacred texts, and they didn't think about what about the things you do with your body, and then furthermore, what do you do? How do we account for the ways that bodies interact with other things? And that's the thing that your book does really brilliantly. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the temple lot in Independence, because this is a great space where we can see both physical and interpretive contestation of sacred space.
So when Joseph Smith declared that Independence, Missouri was Zion, believers wanted to go live there because he took this concept that was key to their faith and said, it's a place that you can point to on a map. It's a place that you can go to. And that was a really appealing call. And so Edward Partridge, who was an early member of the church, went to Independence and purchased 63 and a half acres. And that 63 and a half acres is still all owned by different groups that claim Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon in distinct ways. So the majority of that space, 40 acres, is owned by the Community of Christ, the group that coalesced around Joseph Smith III as their prophet, and they have built a temple there, which is their only temple. And they, I think, narrate their temple in a way that's set over against Latter-day Saint temples. So you'll see signage all around about how everyone is welcome in the temple at any time, which I think is a claim against the Latter-day Saint temples. And they also talk about how women can hold the priesthood in their church. And so there are various ways of marking that space as different from the Latter-day Saint space. The Latter-day Saint Church owns about 20 acres, and they have a visitor center there that is much like other visitor centers, but does talk about the role of independence in the Utah church. And then the last group owns a very small portion of the 63 and a half acres, but it's a significant portion because it's the site that Joseph Smith said was the place where the temple should be built. And so they are often called the temple lot because of their focus on we have the place that he designated. And so would argue against the other churches, your temple isn't, argue against the community of Christ, your temple isn't actually in the right spot. So the temple lot group is really interesting, and they have not built a temple there. What they have is a meeting house and then a visitor center. They haven't built a temple there because they don't yet have the funds to do that. At various times in history, they have thought they did and started and then weren't able to build one. But what's so fascinating about the Temple Lot Visitor Center is that when you go in, there's almost this altar-like spot that has two stones in a glass case. And the stones are stones that were found in that space that they believe that Joseph Smith used to mark exactly where the corners of the temple should be. And outside their visitor center, there are actually markers that say, this is where X stone was found. So it's this very literal reading of space going on. And so their claim to being the true church is very much tied to having that space.
There are a couple of important things to pay attention to here. First of all, lived religion in this sense pays attention to both place and bodies. And so I want to talk a little bit about how the sort of sensory experience of these kinds of things, like the temple lot, plays into the kinds of claims that both places and things make on religious identity. So people like, David Morgan, religious studies scholar, will talk about, you quote him talking about how a thing in space is a thing for us. In other words, there's no such thing as like a disinterested pen. A pen doesn't make claims on human beings. A pen makes claims on human beings when human beings use the pen or orient themselves towards that pen. So maybe talk a little bit about, the importance of sensory experience. I think one of the things we can point to here in the book is the kinds of scripting that go on that are used by Latter-day Saints on trek in orienting the body towards certain kinds of experience in space.
If I can go back to the stones for a minute, one of the things that I thought was really interesting when I visited the Temple Lot Visitor Center and talked with one of the guides was he said by far the majority of visitors to the visitor center are Latter-day Saints. So they're wanting to see the stones. There's some draw to stones that Joseph Smith touched, and these stones are imbued with these narratives about Zion. But he said those LDS visitors do not want to hear what he has to say. And that makes total sense because he's going to narrate those stones and their meaning in a different way. And so they're drawn to the object, but they don't want any of the narratives or the symbolism of that object to be offered by somebody with a contested claim to the object.
Yeah, and of course this shows up in Nauvoo too, right? With like the red brick store, is owned by Community of Christ, and there are lots of spaces where it's to a visitor, it's not quite clear who owns the space. There is signage, and people will tell you if you ask, but it's not always clear if you're just walking through town, like, oh, I'm in so-and-so's terrain now. And so people end up, relating to doing their own interpretation of objects and space, and then also having these other interpretations brought out to them. So maybe you could talk a little bit about Trek and the ways that religion becomes felt religion in the ways that it's scripted.
So Trek is a ritual that started before 1997, but 1997 was, I think, the year that it really gained in popularity because sesquicentennial celebration. And there was a group that decided to make the entire trek to Utah, and they took several months to do that. Many of them dressed as pioneers. They tried to be in their own framing as authentic as possible. And so I think that really popularized trek as an activity for believers. And what's interesting is it's become a popular ritual for teenagers. And so church groups will find a place to trek, and they often will do a lot of preparation work. So the teens might be asked to research a particular pioneer so that they have kind of a personal identification with the story when they go. Often they make their own pioneer clothing, so there's a lot of material anticipation, if that's an okay term, built building up to the trek. And then they will often push hand carts. And hand carts, I think, have become an important symbol of the Mormon pioneer story for a lot of different reasons, but primarily because I think they can symbolize the hard work and sacrifice component of that story. And then they will either go to sites along the Mormon Trail, or if they're nowhere near the Mormon Trail, they might find a site with a particularly large hill to push and pull the hand carts over.
Yeah, the hill is really key, right? Like this is actually part of the memory, and this is really interesting because you bring up hand carts, for instance. Of course, hand carts are not part of the vanguard companies in 1847 and 1848. Like this is taking place 10 years later, right? And yet in Mormon memory, at least popular Latter-day Saint memory, that is what a pioneer is. Pioneer is not a covered wagon; it's a hand cart, right?
Right. And I think the hand cart can symbolize that kind of struggle and sacrifice, and it also can set the Mormon pioneer narrative apart from the other narratives of movement westward, which are often symbolized with the covered wagon. So the Trek experience has the church as an institution has really tried to control what the Trek experience looks like. So there are a lot of documents that explain how things are supposed to happen on the Trek. And I think that is in part because people were making up parts of the Trek that they wanted to reenact, and that has caused some embarrassment for the church. And so one of the pieces of the Trek experience that's supposed to happen with these teens is their parents are supposed to write them letters ahead of time that explain to the teen the parents' own experiences of coming to know that the church is true. So their own testimonies of the truthfulness of the church. And then they are, prior to what's the section that's called solo time, a leader of the Trek gives a talk where they also give their testimony. And then the teen is sent off with the letters that their parents have written. And that's supposed to be the time where they have these experiences of what I've called felt religion, where they kind of in an embodied way come to know about the truthfulness of the church. And part of what I talk about is that, the church itself really emphasizes the physical knowing of the Spirit, and that's something that has to be taught. So believers have to be taught what feelings and physical experiences are signs that the Spirit is communicating with them. And I think the Trek serves as one of those moments, at least from the institution's perspective, where a teenager might have those kinds of experiences because it's part of this larger embodied ritual that has this pioneer story and all of the theology that comes with it.
So do you, in your research, did you find that that's how Latter-day Saint teenagers react to this? Or what's their relationship to these sorts of scripted opportunities for felt religion?
I found a diversity of experiences, but I definitely found people that didn't happen for, and I didn't find a lot of evidence. And I didn't do quantitative survey, but it was a qualitative one. But I had a lot of folks who may have had meaningful experiences, but it was often in other sections of the Trek, especially when they were physically laboring with a handcart. That seemed to be the focus of many of the most meaningful experiences. But I would argue that even if they don't have that solo time intense moment, that's still part of the training to feel the spirit.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is a, this is a socialization into, into a certain kind of ability to experience. I want to pick your brain a little bit about something you talk about in the book, which is that as part of the spiritualization of the pioneer that takes place, particularly increasingly over the 20th century, trek begins to take place outside of the United States. And so the handcart experience and things like the women's pole and those kinds of things are being practiced all over the place. I think you even mentioned this happening in like Mongolia or something like that. What do you know about that, and how has that helped to construct or not a kind of global Latter-day Saint identity of the pioneer?
Well, I think those international examples of trekking show instances where the pioneerification narrative is elastic enough to include people who aren't Americans, and that those treks are often happening, again, going over the biggest hill in the area, is showing that physical access to the story and the idea that the physical is making it feel more real is present for those believers.
Yeah, of course, one of the major functions of religion is adaptation over time, while at the same time trying to maintain a sense of continuity with the universal, or with what's most important about its past and about its relation to, what some scholars would call ultimate concern or deity or whatever. So obviously we've talked about some of these instances of contestation over space or of felt religion. I want to turn now to more of the conceptual work that you do with how Latter-day Saints deal with memory, how Latter-day Saints deal with their identity, and the work that they have to do to maintain that sense of continuity as changes happen. What role does forgetting play in the ways that Latter-day Saints conceive of the past?
I think that forgetting is a really important part of collective memory, and that there's much more forgotten by groups than remembered. And I think the idea that memory is like a sieve, so we're always, as individuals, our brains are always taking out pieces of things that don't matter. But at the collective level, and I guess this is true at the individual level as well, but at the collective level, there are also pieces that of memory that don't fit into the narrative that a group is trying to tell about itself. And that definitely happens at the individual level too. But there are times when groups intentionally try to forget. So there's a concerted effort to change a memory or to just not remember it. And then there are also times when the identity narratives, I think, are so persuasive that members might unknowingly be leaving aspects of the story out. And so one of the examples that I use, well, I'll mention two actually. I think the displacement of indigenous peoples in Utah is part of the narrative that gets left out. And an example of that, I think, is happening at This Is the Place Park. There's a section of it called the Native American Village, and it's set apart from the rest of the park, but it's in the section that's called like the Living History section. So if we're thinking about it in that frame, living history, and you go to the Native American Village and there's not a single date on anything there. So I think that indicates this type of forgetfulness that's happening. So there was a move fairly recently to include that portion. So there's an effort to include the stories of indigenous Utahns. But at the same time, the narrative is portrayed as timeless. And so I think what that does is it allows visitors to not relate the pioneer story to the story of the experiences of Native peoples. So they can visit that park and visit both of the sections and not think that there are power dynamics at work in what happened, and that those two stories are actually twin stories. So that would be one example. A second example that I look at is Mountain Meadows and the massacre that happened there. And there's a lot of great work that's been done on Mountain Meadows. My small contribution to that is looking at how that gets remembered on the landscape. And the title of that chapter is called Anxious Landscapes. And I think that in that I'm trying to show that this kind of determination to not remember what happened at Mountain Meadows as part of Mormon history telling shows that desire to have the pioneer narrative be a narrative of innocence and one that can be celebrated. And so any kind of story that shows that things are more complex, that believers weren't always the innocent ones, can be really disruptive to the collective memory.
Yeah, while you were describing these two examples of Mormon forgetfulness, you reminded me of the 1893 World's Fair and the ways that the fair organizers chose to, in their anthropology exhibition, chose to exhibit native artifacts as a way of separating the identity of American whiteness that they were exhibiting from this kind of timeless primitiveness of the natives of the frontier. And so we have a couple of really interesting and complex narratives that are coming together in the Mormon story. We have this notion of civilization and progress. It's very much a part of the American Liberal Project. We also have the eschatological concept of Zion, and so when you put those things together, you have still this idea that there needs to be progress. That progress is related to westward expansion. That progress is related to this incremental improvement, and yet we still need to maintain the innocence of the settler colonists, and or the purity, maybe we could say, of the settler colonists. And so there's this really complex work going on here that you really exhibit in a great way. This has been a fantastic conversation. I'm really grateful that you were able to spend some time with us here today. We're almost out of time, but I wonder if you could tell us what books you're reading right now in either Mormon studies or religious studies that may be of interest to our listeners.
Sure. Because I'm in the midst of a semester, I don't get to read as quickly or as much as I would like to, but I'm currently reading two books to write a review essay, and that's Taylor Petrie's Tabernacles of Clay and Megan Goodwin's Abusing Religion. That's where I'm going next.
Awesome. And so you're writing this review essay. Do you have any other projects either currently or coming down the pike that you're working on that we can expect from you in the future?
I am currently writing an article length piece about LGBTQ Mormons and felt religion. So thinking about how their narratives about how the spirit works may be a challenge to institutional stories about how the spirit works, or may just be a theological challenge to some of the claims that the church has made.
Wow, fascinating. And that you anticipate that probably coming out next year sometime?
I hope so, yes.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. This has been great.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thank you for listening to Scholars and Saints. Today, we learned about the ways in which Latter-day Saints have marked their memories, so to speak, on the landscape of the American West. Often these memorials are sites of contestation, where multiple heirs of Joseph Smith's legacy jockey for interpretive dominance. Latter-day Saint memory has not just been marked on space, though. Today, we also learned that the spiritualization of the figure of the pioneer has become one of the primary ways that Latter-day Saints have adapted to a more inclusive global identity. Memory, of course, also involves forgetting. and this can create challenges, especially for marginalized groups and sensitive historical events. Next time on Scholars and Saints, join me as I chat with Mark Ashurst McGee and Michael Hubbard McKay about their new book, Producing Ancient Scripture, Joseph Smith's Translation Projects in the Development of Mormon Christianity. Until next time, I'm Stephen Betts.